All right. So we welcome you to our September. Okay. And we're just going to ask if you could turn off your microphones because there is an echo. Okay. Good. That worked. Okay. So welcome to our FoSTRA Homes for All Working Group meeting. And our webinar is on the theme of Housing for All. We thank our members and new friends who have taken the time to attend this presentation. Also, we're honored tonight to have, or we will have, some representatives or constituency officer members from various levels of government. We plan on bringing you more educational experiences such as this over the course of the year. A few housekeeping tips before we begin. For the purposes of our minute taker, we are recording this presentation. A link to the minutes, a complete webinar slide deck, and other valuable links will be available shortly after the webinar. So let's take a look at our team protocols. And if you are, you should be seeing our meeting protocol slide up. So the meeting will start with your microphone muted and your camera off. Please note the icons in the graphics on your screen. We'll just go through them. There is a microphone control. Clicking on this icon will mute or unmute your microphone when you are directed to do so. The camera control, clicking on this will start or stop your camera when directed. Clicking on the chat icon will allow you to write a question or comment. And the same thing with the Q&A icon. We'll be accepting questions or comments via the chat feature or the Q&A feature. And clicking on the reaction icons will allow you to provide a quick comment, such as a thumbs up or, well, we have quite a selection of comments in there. Also, note the raising of the hand is there if you wish to ask a question when we have the Q&A portion directly from the floor if you don't want to type it in. And so our meeting will be now called to order. I'm Mike Bethke, and I'll be the chair for this evening. Many hands have gone into the development of this presentation and now work behind the scenes and on the screen to bring this to you. And I wish to thank Lynn-Ann Mulrooney for taking on the role of secretary to keep the minutes, and Liz McGroarty, who was our timekeeper, with the desperate job of keeping me on track. Thanks also go to Don Young and Alan Bartel for their on-screen work tonight. Our agenda is on the screen. That should keep us on track and on time tonight. And I'm going to now ask Don Young to read FoSTRA's Indigenous Land Acknowledgement.
Okay. Well, FoSTRA acknowledges that South Toronto has been the site of human activity for at least 15,000 years. It is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. Today, Takaranto continues to be home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We are grateful for the opportunity to live and work on this territory. We are also mindful of broken covenants and the need to strive to make things right. As treaty people, we commit to listen, learn, and work towards justice and reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. And now I'm going to start this portion of our webinar with a brief overview of FoSTRA. Our members consist of resident associations within Toronto's wards 9, 10, 4, and 13, as well as the south part of Ward 11 below Bloor. We're always welcoming new members and new resident associations. FoSTRA is a nonpartisan federation of South Toronto residents associations that collaborates to help influence the creation of policies at all levels of government. We preserve and enhance the quality of life for Torontonians, and we promote neighborhood identity and vitality and ensure responsible and respectful development within our boundaries. And on to the next slide. So on the screen, you can see 4 of our major strategic areas: intensification, infrastructure, environment, and affordable housing. And it's from that 4th affordable housing that we have our, I'm getting ahead of this. I'm going to escape that for a second and just go back. And F5. There we go. The Homes for All group has developed their raison d'etre, where housing should be a human right, and everybody should be housed either through private enterprise or government support. We're looking at focusing on those who live on the street without housing, and those who need rent geared to income from those paying more than 30% of their income for rent or are inadequately housed. So we're working to try as much as we can to get our community as part of the 15-minute. I don't know what's happening here. 15-minute city. And now I'm going to ask Don Young, the FoSTRA Director for Ward, to introduce our special guest.
Okay, thank you. Rebekah Young is Vice President, Head of Inclusion and Resilient Economics with Scotiabank. Rebekah joined Scotiabank in 2019 as Director of Fiscal and Provincial Economics, while also covering the global auto sector. Previously, she held senior roles at the IMF and the Federal Department of Finance and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. She holds a BA in Chemical Engineering from McGill University, a Master of Science in Environmental Policy from the London School of Economics in the UK, and an MBA from the l'Institut Européen d'Administration des Affaires, a graduate school in France. Scotiabank has appointed Rebekah Young as its first Head of Inclusion and Resilience Economics, with a mandate to provide leadership on how inclusive economic growth can drive stronger, more durable, more adaptive economies, with broadly shared improvements in well-being for all. In this role, Rebekah is dealing with the key issues of our time: climate change, technological transformation, economic disruption, labor demographics, and more. Through a lens that includes more than broad macroeconomic concerns, she focuses on sectoral and even household vulnerabilities that can stand in the way of prosperity. There are 2 key priorities, Young says. One is advancing the idea of inclusion and grounding it in economic principles. How do you ensure that everyone can participate not only in the gains of economic activity, but also be able to contribute and shape the creation of that prosperity? What are the economic paradigm and policy shifts that would ensure we capitalize on these evolving trends and that no part of society gets left behind? Rebekah?
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm pleased to be invited. I think it is an honor to speak to your group, and you certainly are in the center of, I would say, some of the acute housing affordability issues that we are seeing across the country. Let me just pull up a few slides, and as I'm doing so, though, I want to unpack my title, which is new for Scotiabank, but really, first of all, to say that, you know, I'm perched within the economic shop at Scotiabank. Just want to make sure if you can see the slides pulling up yet. Okay, so you can, So I am within the Scotiabank economic shop, and now normally economists at least on Bay Street, talk about the medium term as being next year. And right now we're living in sort of a high frequency, fast changing environment where it's really difficult even to forecast where things are going next month, next quarter, let alone next year. So my job in my role as head of inclusion and resilience economics is to lift my head up a bit and look beyond next year, look out a couple of years from now and look at, how does our economy look like? What are some of those structural factors or drivers underway? And importantly, if we don't like where they are heading, are there changes that we can make now, either policy or otherwise, that would lead us on a better trajectory over the medium term? So it really is a sort of a different role for economists to play. And the title also can be far-reaching, as is already mentioned by Dawn, from the topics that that it can encompass. So I'm looking day to day at what are some of these big challenges that we're facing across the country and in Canada that really will impact our future. And so, not surprisingly, housing affordability is one of those. Now, I'm going to put a caveat that I know everybody wants to jump to, so what should we do? And that's really, I'll start from the beginning saying that I'm a macroeconomist. I look sort of at high level macroeconomic data and where things are going and don't get into the policy prescription. I think we can have a discussion about that at the end, but I think one of the kind of objectives, or I should say one of the impacts of me digging into the issue, was to lay it out using data that's out there publicly available and in terms that people can understand, that policymakers that it can really resonate with policymakers just how big some of the challenges are, and importantly also bring the voice of a big institution like Scotiabank behind some of these issues. So really bringing stakeholders together and thinking about issues in different ways, seeing more urgency behind issues. So I just want to make sure that the advance function is working here. So do you see slide 2 with a lot of words? Okay. So, if so like rewind about a year ago, I was asked to look at housing, in my new role, and really given no parameters, about what issue, what angle I should take in my analysis. So I really started diving into the data. And I guess what, two key takeaways for me that, one of the bottom lines was that, housing affordability hurts everyone in Canada. So even if you as an individual or as a household are, not within that kind of definition of housing affordability in terms of that 30% income spent on shelter threshold, it does permeate through so many different channels into our overall economic outcomes. And one big one just being that as Canadians, as we're spending more and more on housing, whether it's ownership or rent, we're spending less, investing less on other stuff, other sectors, other productivity enhancing sectors in the economy. So there really is an opportunity cost as we see more and more being spent on housing that ultimately affects all of us. But it does affect lower income households in Canada far more acutely than it does, and has more direct implications for these households. And the language I have on this side is that it risks undermining our immigration growth model that we've seen over the last few years. Now, this text was actually written, at the beginning of the year when I had published the paper "Housing Affordability Hurts." I would, delete risks undermining at this point, because we've seen even, very rapid discourse around these issues in recent months around population growth. But sort of going back to that first bottom line is that housing affordability hurts everybody, not just the Canadians that, are most acutely and most immediately hurt by housing affordability. But the second takeaway for me, when I really looked at the data and looked at, what the data were saying to me, was that, quite frankly, the gaps and the shortfalls that we're facing across Canada are enormous. And that, yes, we need, we need housing, more housing supply, more solutions across the whole continuum. And we need to keep stressing the urgency there and, and dramatically there. But, quite frankly, the gaps are so big that we probably need a kind of a two-pronged approach here in that, we need that, full spectrum trickle down approach, but the trickle down isn't likely going to be fast enough or enough for those Canadians that are at the acute end of the housing spectrum. So we're likely going to need very targeted measures to address these issues if we're going to have any meaningful change at that end of the spectrum. So, this isn't a macro presentation, obviously, but I do want to kind of put it into context. And particularly part of my role also is to give, to kind of frame, anchor discussions in very real terms in what's going on now and what needs to happen in the future. And so, it's certainly no surprise to everybody that, we're seeing affordability strains everywhere, that we saw inflation last year tick up to, above 8% year over year. And that's a generational high. Many people, many younger Canadians haven't seen inflation this high before. And it happened very, very rapidly. So the cost of everything really skyrocketed. We consequently saw the Bank of Canada raise its overnight interest rate from just 0.25% to 5% over the, barely more than a year. So a very sharp pace of escalation in where that overnight rate went. Now, again, for some Canadians, never seeing highs like this. For older Canadians, they would have seen it in the past, but, quite some time ago. So for kind of that near-term memory, certainly just the kind of the scale and the pace of how quickly interest rates have gone up. And importantly, also the Bank of Canada's overnight rate has gone up, we've seen market rates go up. And I show here in data the 5-year government bond, which is really important for housing markets. So you see that really climbing very rapidly as well as we see the overnight rate going up. Now, putting on that short-term economist hat, we saw data just coming out this week that inflation in Canada remains persistent and puts more risk that we might see even more interest rate hikes in Canada before we see some relief. But all this just to paint that picture that, we've seen, we are seeing already affordability strains across the Canadian economy, and interest rates are starting to have a cooling effect on demand in the economy. But when you look at housing, quite frankly, it's been defying many forecasters just in their resilience, if you can use that word, in housing markets across the country. And quite frankly, what happened to housing markets in Canada during the pandemic was just unsustainable. That if you look at the price movement across the country and within regions, that the average house price across Canada increased by 50% from the onset of the pandemic to that peak early in 2022 before the Bank of Canada started raising rates. We saw sales activity, so the number of house resales across the country increased by 50% from pre-pandemic to kind of those heady days where we had lots of stimulus in the economy. And so, of course, in comes Bank of Canada, raises interest rates, and we saw a sharp correction in housing prices. But I really hesitate to use the word correction, because what we saw is a dip in housing prices, but already in recent months, we've seen house prices starting to climb right back up, speaking to the enormity of the challenge of this mismatch of, very low supply, limited and, lackluster supply against strong demand, across all regions pretty much in the country. And I would also say we're seeing more or less sort of a normalization. So you might see fear mongering in headlines about, housing market data that's coming out every month that, that housing is tanking. But quite frankly, we're coming back to, kind of sales activity that's more consistent with pre-pandemic. And again, putting this into context, recall what I just said about where interest rates are and just, affordability, all these things that would normally put the brakes on the Canadian economy very, very abruptly are really not working that well in housing markets. It's having some effect, but already with that uptick in prices really speaks to just how deep the supply-demand imbalance is. And so when you aggregate all the different costs of home ownership, including kind of home prices to interest rates or mortgage costs, what we see, the Bank of Canada has a housing affordability index, and we've really, we saw it skyrocket, as prices took off in the pandemic. And then the baton passed from being driven by house prices to being driven not just by still elevated house prices, but now also high interest rate and mortgage costs. And so we're seeing both structural and cyclical factors behind that. So, math is pretty simple, that as house prices increase, even at low interest rates, what you pay to service that debt is high. But now where we are with these cyclical factors, you have a high house price plus high debt servicing on those houses. And so, I'll keep alluding to this kind of supply demand behind the shortages that we're seeing. But I think this picture is really, really kind of sharp. And if I showed you a higher frequency, you'd see almost a linear uptick in where Canadian population growth has been going. So Canada added 1 million to its population last year. And you really see that's phenomenal, both on a historic basis and relative to peers. And I think it's only been in the last couple of months that there's been this growing awareness of just how quickly population is ticking up, that, even, 6 to 12 months ago, people would look at our immigration targets, which were, just shy of 500,000, and think that was enormous. Well, when the numbers tallied last year and we saw 1 million, we realized that it's not just newcomers or permanent residents, but there are a whole slew of other categories that are really, putting pressure on the margin on housing demand. Now, I would be, careful to say on the margin, because, we can get into this in the discussion, is that newcomers and immigration have not caused the shortages that we are seeing, or the acute housing affordability issue, but they are coming into a system that is already under, extreme pressure. And, these charts show, at least the first chart is, sort of pre-population acceleration, just looking at, our physical infrastructure, or the stock of housing relative to our population and relative to what it is for G7 peers. And you see that Canada, its number of houses per population is well below that of our G7 peers. And for Ontario in particular, even relative to Canada, the stock of housing is well short of, of those, arguably somewhat arbitrary benchmarks of what our stock is, but it does kind of signify just how short stock is. And the second chart is really showing that when you show our stock relative to population growth, that you do, again, see that this deterioration that supply really hasn't been coming online with population growth for years now. It's particularly acute as we look, towards that last few months, last year, as population has really upticked. But again, kind of underscoring that, the supply side of the equation is certainly a very big one that we're watching. I would say, looking both at the diagnosis of the issue as well as some of the possible solutions, this isn't new. Certainly for Scotiabank, we've been an advocate for solutions and also for, talking about the issues for years now. And just as an example, our CEO chaired the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force that came out with a paper last year that had 55, headline recommendations. When you tallied the sub-recommendations, 74 recommendations of things that could be done to relieve housing pressures within Ontario's borders. And so, it's a very comprehensive report. We saw earlier this month that, Ontario's new housing minister has said that that we have, implemented 21 of those 74 recommendations. So I would, say, intent is there, whether you look at municipal, provincial, or federal. We are seeing signs that policymakers are, well aware of the acute issues on the table, are, looking for policy solutions, not necessarily always together, and not necessarily at the pace or the urgency that, that perhaps is called for. But clearly, again, putting on the optimism hat is that certainly things like this task force report are anchoring discussions and getting policymakers to think about some of the solutions that have been brought together by multi-stakeholder processes like the one that Scotiabank was involved in earlier. But at the same time, clearly, we have far more progress to go. We have far more actions that still can be taken. And importantly, many of these actions do take time. And I guess the less optimistic, the less optimistic signs are that, when we look at sort of on the ground signs as to whether we are making progress, the picture is a little more dismal. And so if you look, for example, the Canadian Home Builders Association did a snapshot of major municipalities in 2022 versus 2020 on a whole host of metrics. I'm just showing you two here, but for example, municipal charges, that are added on to development, whether it's high rise or low rise, certainly are very high, particularly for municipalities like Toronto. And at the same time, the length of time for approvals for more than half of the municipalities in the study has actually gotten longer, not shorter, over this.
Do we have a freeze? Or is it me?
Looks like a freeze to me too.
Freeze.
We'll see. I think Rebekah had a freeze, and we'll get her back in shortly. And we're back.
Apologies for that. Give me just 2 minutes to get the slides back up. Okay, apologies for that little intermission there. And maybe this is, intentionally cut off at the less optimistic slides, which were really talking about, actual signs as to whether we are making progress or not. And, so this study is really saying when we look at things like development charges, when we look at, approval times, really the picture isn't bright. And so we still have more progress there. And we can get into it into discussion. I do have some sympathy when it comes to things like development charges. And we've certainly seen, in Toronto, for example, during the mayoral elections, just it is with our decentralized governments and, certain levels of government having only certain levers, certain fiscal levers. And again, of the many challenges we have to solve, I think that is one of them that we need to, look at. If we really need more supply, we need to look at, still how can communities be, fiscally and financially sustainable, yet all the policy levers pointing in the right direction. Let me just go to the next slide. So, I gave one set of data looking at sort of dismal progress on bringing more supply online. If we look at alternate data, or specifically if we look at government data that looks at completions relative to starts, is that the picture again is pretty dismal, that it's actually been 3 decades now in Canada where it's just taking longer and longer to build new housing, build new units across the country. So this has been a long-standing challenge that, over time we're adding more and more friction to building supply across the country. And, the second chart, is interesting. This is the number of starts. So the number of, new units that, we've, across the country on an annual basis, have, are, kind of shovel in the ground. And what I would say, I fell victim to kind of brief optimism when I looked at this chart initially, because you see, after 2020, pandemic hits, lots of, heightened activity, and you see housing starts just take off. And so if you think supply is the issue, you look at that and you get quite excited that maybe we're heading somewhere. But, what was eye-opening for me when I looked at those numbers, which have since, slowed down with higher interest rates and higher cost of everything, is that, CMHC says that we actually, the shortfall of housing by 2030 is somewhere in the order of 6 million new houses, so 3.5 million above and beyond what baseline would see in increased housing. That translates right now into about 800,000 new units a year between now and 2030 that we need to build. If you look at that axis there, we're somewhere around 250 to 300,000. So really, again, that uptick was really pretty marginal relative to the scale of what we actually need. And that was, this data in particular was really kind of key to me when I was trying to understand how acute the shortfall was and, what it means for, for certain segments of the Canadian population. But stepping back, not surprisingly, looking at sort of the longer term implications of this is that, Canadians are increasingly renters, not homeowners. And so over the last decade, we've seen a decline in home ownership such that about 2/3 of Canadians own, and renters are increasing at about twice the pace of homeowners just between the last 2 censuses. And it's not that Canadians are opting into renting because it's more affordable. If anything, it is the opposite that we've seen over the last 2 years. And what we've seen across the country in many big municipalities is that rental prices have been increasing double-digit year over year. And the numbers are actually muted when you look at the stock. And this second chart shows Toronto, non-turnover. So this is folks that are, staying in their apartment and, what is that full stock, how much is rent changing year over year. What you see though is for the turnover, and particularly, for example, newcomers that are coming into Toronto looking for a place to rent, that price appreciation is really, much higher. And, just to translate, for a 2022 in December, the average rent in Toronto, if you're trying to break into the market, would have been above $2,000 versus, the average, of all stock being somewhere around 1,600. So it really is, just, not, Canadians aren't by and large shifting into renting because it's more affordable. It's that they are increasingly priced out of home ownership. And so it's also, not surprising that that housing affordability is particularly acute for renters. And, when we look at, the data that we have publicly available on core housing need and housing affordability is from StatsCan data. Canadians were polled early in 2021. And keep in mind, things were pretty good then. We didn't yet have, our inflation crises or interest rates high. We also still had many of the government benefits from the pandemic flowing. And even then, what we saw is that, one in 5 Canadians were living in what would be categorized as unaffordable housing, so spending 30% or more of their before tax income on shelter related costs. For renters, that number was closer to 1 in 3 renters. Now, if we look at core housing need, which is that there's, either inadequate, unsuitable, or unaffordable, and that not only are they spending more than 30%, but there is no alternative. So they're not opting to spend more on housing, but there's simply no other market alternative that's affordable. The picture for renters is even more stark. And I would say when you dive down to Toronto, the numbers are even, are worse than they are at the national level. And so, certainly that 3 in 10 renters in Toronto would be living in core housing need. And again, that's stats data from census that is now dated. And I would say all drivers would point to, a more acute situation, and that the data would look worse if we had more up-to-date data. And so what I did just as a simple exercise was to look at just how acute this, the core housing need for renters was and is across Canada. And so I calculated the shortfall for, Canadians based by income quintiles, Canadian renters by income quintile, to understand just what would their shortfall be on a monthly basis if they were to afford market rent in their province and still meet that threshold of 30% of their income spent on shelter. And quite frankly, these were the numbers that, really blew me out of the water when I looked at them. And if you take how Ontario, for example, for the lowest income quintile, so the bottom 20% of renters in Ontario, the shortfall on a monthly basis exceeds $1,000 if they were to meet that affordability threshold. Even for the second income quintile, so now the kind of the next 20% of renters, the shortfall is still somewhere in the order of $600 to $700 a month. And when I contrasted that to what policymakers are trying to do to alleviate some of the shortfalls, the Canada Housing Benefit, for example, had offered a $500 benefit. They topped it up with another one-time $500. This is kind of once in a lifetime, a one-time benefit relative to these shortfalls that we're talking about on a monthly basis. These households would need this type of transfer to offset the housing affordability that they are facing. And so, again, putting on my economist hat, I looked at, what is the opportunity cost of having, acute shortage of housing and, at that end of the spectrum. And I looked again for publicly available sources for data. And in this case, looked at, a very, grounded counterfactual study by the Mental Health Commission of Canada, looking at the cost of not providing housing at this end of the spectrum. And what they did is, they costed out basically that $10 in supportive housing would lead to $22 in avoided costs. And these, the chart just shows a couple of comparative costs. The cost of social housing on a monthly basis is well short, is multiples less than it is in other institutions that Canadians may find themselves in if they cannot find, adequate, suitable housing in the community. So, just putting on that economist hat, that the cost of avoidance before looking at some of the social costs, really, there's a very compelling case for a housing first approach when we look at housing across the spectrum. And so really, that brought me to that, again, going back to the bottom line of my analysis, housing affordability hurts, is, bottom line that, that we still need to tackle the whole continuum, that we can't forget, there is like a broader housing supply, broader housing affordability, across, pretty much pervasive across, many households across Canada, but that we need to be able to attack, not just tackle not just the urgent, but the important, both now and over the medium term. And, for me, that really translated into, urgency around doing something at that, deeply unaffordable end of the spectrum, and that social housing end, something ambitious, something well-resourced. And so, I threw out just an example, why not aim to double the stock of social housing, and really no magic behind it. That would just bring us up to the average of G7 peers in terms of, of social housing, but really also, a strategy that's well-resourced and recognizes that we can't wait for, more housing to come online across the continuum to trickle down to alleviate needs at this end of the spectrum. So ultimately find that, this type of, ambition that is resourced could ultimately be more cost efficient for governments in the long run, and more, resonate or be more responsive to the immediate needs of most vulnerable Canadians in the near term. So I will, I'm going to stop sharing now and really open for questions or reflections. And importantly, again, I want to, underscore, I'm by no means, have a strong view on particular policies, because quite frankly, there isn't a panacea. I think that we are going to need many solutions, and I think many solutions need to be locally driven, and, the needs locally identified. And my message really is sort of a, Houston, we have a problem. Really try to elevate the discourse to a higher level, to trigger and bring stakeholders together to have those needed conversations about what those solutions could look like.
Thank you very much, Rebekah. We just have some time now for any questions, or if anybody would like to pop in. And Waleed, I see your hand is up, so please let's make sure I can allow your microphone. And if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question or make a statement. Thank you. Okay, Waleed, are you, can you unmute yourself? Okay. And all right, I see everything looks good. Do you have access to the chat? Okay. All right, if there is, I'm just going to say to type in your question. All right. And I deactivated the function. All right. Let me try it now. Still deactivated. Okay. Okay, Waleed, if you have access to the chat or the Q&A, would you type in your question? And maybe we could go to one of the questions that we have during the registration. And Alan? So I think, Alan, you should be unmuting yourself. Oh. Okay. No one can, it's deactivated. Now this is unusual. Okay. All right. We'll take questions through the chat, and in the meantime, I'm going to, and that's not happened before.
Michael, I wonder if I could just ask a general question. I know it's one of the questions that was listed. Is what does Rebekah think about the National Housing Accord? Has she had a chance to look at it, and what are her comments about it?
Yes. I think, I certainly, I haven't, the accord itself doesn't provide enough analysis to kind of weigh in on the specific measures. So I won't kind of endorse or kind of reject the accord one way or another. I think it certainly focuses on that renter segment of housing, which we, as I pointed out, the trend suggests that more and more Canadians are renting and that housing affordability remains elusive. So I think that, it does provide a number of, concrete measures, to focus policymakers' minds on that segment. I do think if we're looking to a broader housing strategy, that we need to, also encompass that full spectrum. And so, so I think that we do need more, more engagement, more dialogue, more, concrete proposals on the table. We also need a process to prioritize them. So we need to understand where are we going to get the biggest impact for quite frankly, limited government resources. And so we need, a combination of a, process to prioritize these ideas. We also need a kind of a governance framework to make sure that we're hearing all the voices that need to be heard are weighing in as to what some of these priorities should be. And so I think that, policymakers are, arguably they're a little bit caught in the headlights, deer in the headlights right now, that they've got, they know they've got to do something. The situation has become so acute, but they still need sort of these, these frameworks and prioritization, accountability mechanisms to make sure that, they're doing things in a thoughtful manner and in a way that resonates with, with their own stakeholders.
Great, thank you. And just another question that we had during the registration. Do you have any suggestions for how we can get the 3 levels of government to prioritize providing housing? And it was one of the slides that was in there to the most, and particularly for most vulnerable members.
Well, I think, I guess one, I think history would suggest that, a carrot approach seems to work better. So I think we're seeing a little bit of both, but I think a first best is to look at ways, how do you incentivize different levels of government to work together. And for the feds, certainly the federal government has the bigger balance sheet. They tend to have more capacity to, to fund or finance some of this stuff. And so I think that, certainly is one lever that they can look at to look for willing partners, to take pretty dramatic kind of co-investment approaches in some of these areas. So I think that's certainly, one area. But, quite frankly, this housing isn't the first issue where, kind of a decentralized governance structure in Canada, doesn't seem to be working as well as it should for, optimal outcomes for Canadians. And so, I think that if you look at Canada relative to other countries, that just that level of decentralization is really phenomenal. And so it is, important that we overcome that. I would say a good example might be what was achieved on the childcare front. And so, can we look at models that actually, bring different levels of government online, kind of more aligned or incentivized in the right direction? I think, perhaps a discussion that needs to be had also is, more broadly, I think we need a relook at, our different levers, our different fiscal levers, and, how they are shared across different levels of government. And so certainly if you look at provinces, for example, they're facing burgeoning health costs, now education costs with population growth, but they don't necessarily have the same fiscal levers that we do have at the federal level. And so I'm not saying, one way or another, we need to see transfers. What we need to have that discussion is, do we have, the right kind of fiscal frameworks across layers of government to address some of these, structural forces that we're facing as a, Canadian society, and those include housing, healthcare, aging demographics, just to name a few.
Thank you for that. And I think hopefully Waleed and I have got the problem solved. So Waleed, can you unmute it? There you go.
I hope you can hear me and you can see me, so both things are working. Rebekah, it's so nice to hear your presentation, and I just want to quickly introduce myself. So my name is Waleed Kogalia Ali. I represent the Regent Park Neighborhood Association within FoSTRA, and I'm very involved in my community, supporting community benefits efforts in Regent Park with our new developer partner, Tridel. I'm also on the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Advisory Committee for the City of Toronto. And one of the things that I had two questions, very important question, which is, my biggest concern is what's going to be the broad implications, economic implications of a housing crash in Canada. So I was hoping you could elaborate on your thoughts about that, because I think policymakers and our elected officials need to be aware of those implications, so that we could plan in the long term to ensure that we don't put our economy at risk through the speculative housing market that currently exists. So that's my first question. And then the second question is the role of financial institutions like Scotiabank and others in helping folks prepare for home ownership. So is there a pathway for either newcomers, permanent residents, or new citizens who come to Canada to be able to achieve that Canadian dream of home ownership? So those are the two questions that I'd like to start off. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let me start with the first, and and certainly when I look at the data and think about the chances of a housing crash, and you talked about speculative behavior, that certainly sort of the investors' home buying activity has definitely slowed as interest rates went up, but quite frankly, demand underpinned by this strong population growth, in my mind suggests just such an imbalance, and that we're not likely to face kind of these structural house price crashes that are going to kind of destroy household balance sheets. And so I would say the kind of the bigger likelihood we see right now is house prices tracking back up as they have been over a couple months now, and that it would take a whole lot of supply, and we're not seeing this level of supply that would bring us to a situation where we would see kind of a deep retrenchment in prices that just doesn't recover as we're seeing now. It is, of course, a textbook, kind of challenge that, that could happen. But one thing, you have to keep in mind also, if you're looking at the systemic effects of a house, a house price crash is, I mentioned 2/3 of Canadians are homeowners. 1/3 of Canadians don't actually even have a mortgage. So they, house prices crash. They don't, own. They'll feel less wealthy. There's a wealth effect. They'll feel less wealthy. They might spend a bit less, but they're not in a vulnerable situation, for example, where they could lose their home. For that remaining third, then you have to look at, how many still are in positive equity. So how many, still have, more in home value than what they would owe on mortgages. And so you are looking at, then a much more smaller subset of Canadians that, would be affected, i.e. having purchased a home very recently, experienced a decline in that equity. And then you layer on top of, very strong macroprudential rules that we have in Canadian financial institutions that regulate just how much Canadians can borrow against, things like income and home prices. So there are a lot of kind of bells and whistles in the system that suggest kind of these systemic effects of a, home price crash are not sort of likely the most probable scenario of things that could really kind of systemically hurt our economy. But it is something obviously that, policymakers are regularly looking at. Now, in terms of your second question, I think, first of all, I'll put a caveat that I'm in the economic shop, and sort of we are, intentionally independent from, different parts of the bank that are, for example, our retail or mortgage lending. But we do have, specific programs for, for example, for newcomers that, that are arriving in the country and looking at how can they, have access to banking in a way that supports, their kind of financial health over the long term. What I would say also is that, one of my takeaways from looking at housing and looking at the solutions that we need is that we do need all stakeholders. And sometimes there tends to be a polarization of, well, social housing is about nonprofit or co-ops or government, market housing is about private sector. But I think the risk is that we polarize. And in fact, we need all stakeholders, just to differing degrees. So, at the, if we call it kind of a bucket social housing spectrum, there still is a role, or still could be a better role for harnessing capital in order to, to either acquire or refurbish supply and bring it on, bring more online in that end of the spectrum. Or there, is a role for, for on that construction side that tends to be in private sector. So I think that, I'm speaking very broadly, not specific to the banks or Scotiabank, but, I do think that we need to kind of, reduce some of that polarization and get stakeholders, across different parts of housing need and think about what are the solutions we need, what are the different roles and distinct roles and, and I guess competencies that each partner can bring to the table.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question, Waleed. And it kind of just want to loop onto that, because I think what we're seeing is that we have longer term mortgages that are coming out right now. And what is the economic effect of putting your mortgage out? And I'm thinking because they're going out 40, 50 years. What does that do to the economy? What does that do, to the financial end of things?
Well, so again, this is kind of getting into another area of the bank, but I would say from an economist, a macroeconomist, we look at how big is this situation, and quite frankly, it's not that big. For some Canadians that might be in that exposure, it is, it could be substantial, but kind of from a systems perspective, it isn't like broad swaths of Canadian homeowners that are in that situation. I think also yeah, so I think I don't have a lot to say on that issue. I don't think that we're going there, though, that what we are seeing are changes that that Canadians are refinancing into today's market conditions.
Okay, thank you very much. Waleed's hand is up again.
Sorry, just have a follow-up question. I wouldn't forgive myself if I didn't ask this question. Um, um, I think one of the things that we're looking at, as a neighborhood association, is city policies, and we actually were at the forefront of the work done by the Coalition for Equitable and Inclusive Development to support the City of Toronto's definition of affordable housing that's based on income. And I actually just want to give a shout out to Scotiabank. You folks wrote an amazing report that we use as a resource, but also it helps us better understand the economic climate. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are on policy interventions that could better support access to home ownership and help us address the housing crisis.
Yeah, no, so, first I would, go back, and I realize, some of the answers I'm giving are very, very high level, and that's, and so and I think I started out by saying, I didn't want to disappoint that, that I, intent, my job isn't, figuring out the specific policies. Well, that part of that paper, that you're referencing really was to say this is a really big issue. We've got to get on it, and bring the bank's voice behind it. But I think also intentionally not getting into specifically what is needed, because quite frankly, we're not in the position to identify what's needed. And I think in your position, for example, are very close to, understanding what the needs are. And for me, part of, when I looked at the data, one of the things that struck me was when I was looking at core housing need, I had, you probably won't recall, but one of the charts was looking at a 2-bedroom, and I was actually questioned by somebody, why did you show a 2-bedroom? Were you trying to kind of amplify the, the affordability issue? And I, first of all, whether it's 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom, the gaps were, more or less similar. But when I looked at data, who is in persistent core housing needs. So, Statistics Canada has looked at, demographics that, some go into core housing need. For example, they lose their job, get divorced, or some other kind of lifetime event that leads them into core housing need. Then something happens and they get out of it. But one of the persistent core housing needs are single mothers with children. And so that kind of was an eye-opener for me, is that we increasingly have data to understand which demographics are in most acute need. And in this case, it was actually this demographic likely needs a 2-bedroom or more. And so the solutions, if we are targeting that sort of core housing need, are quite different than it would be, say, for the single senior in core housing need. So, all of that again kind of reinforced and kept me taking a step back, saying, we have a role in, putting our voice behind the urgency and the need, but, other stakeholders closer to the ground, understanding the specific needs of the local populations, have a big role in identifying what do those needs look like? What do those, units, what do the, actually look like? And not just, I would say also, understanding that it's not just the unit, the physical unit that we need to be looking at, but the social infrastructure around it. So again, if you look at that single mother example, are we looking at, housing that is, close to either childcare or schools? Is it close to transit so the mother can, get to work? Is it close to groceries so, a vehicle isn't necessarily needed? So that we need to increasingly need take this broader focus and, in that type of knowledge and insight and, connectedness to local community is happening within organizations like your own.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one other question from the registration. It's the province is targeting 1.5 million homes to be built by 2030. Where do you see bottlenecks and where should we prioritize? So is it land shortage, labor, materials, bureaucracy? And are you aware of any examples where incentives to build small homes rather than resource intensive larger homes?
Well, that's a good question and a difficult one to kind of put numbers to it. I think the easy answer is that it's all of the above, and so that is one of the challenges. Is that I think that all of those drivers are a challenge. I mean, the land shortage is different depending on which community or geography you're looking at, because we see kind of the green belt in Ontario, in GTA, or land, the landlocked GVA, Vancouver. So, that's certainly one. I would say labor, we're increasingly seeing, is, a very real constraint. And again, I would say, to me, over the medium term, like let's say we do get the political will to, remove some of those bureaucratic barriers, and we overcome some of the material bottlenecks that we've seen over the last couple of years. Well, labor, just, the number of, plumbers to electricians, those numbers are really high when again, referencing that, that 6 million unit shortfall that CMHC points to. Quite frankly, probably we can't bring enough, plumbers into the country to do that. And I think, it is a good question, on incentives to build smaller homes, but I think, I think that's an important question more broadly. We need to think about, what are the ways to change demand? So if we, can't realistically build all the supply that would meet kind of a business as usual trend in growth, how can we look at changing the nature of demand or the way that we live or the way that we want to live? And so what are the changes that we need to do there to, to rethink that? And I think, so we need more, questions like that about building smaller homes or, multi-generational living. And we're seeing some policies about, retrofitting so that you can have, whether it's in-laws, aging parents, or, adult children living within, or, we've seen, measures to, to couple some kind of student populations with, with seniors with empty bedrooms. So I think that we do need to, and there is this bucket, of innovation on the demand side that I think we need to have more of a conversation about, not just on supply.
So I'm just kind of getting from that too, and it when you were talking about how, we need to consider a lot of different areas when we're talking about social housing. And it sounds that building bedroom communities is not what we need. We need to have more of a, and to use the phrase, the 15-minute community, where that you can walk to get a lot of the things that you need, transit or doctors or groceries and this type of stuff. And that would be beneficial for the economy.
Yes, yeah, I think I think it'll be very much demographic specific, and so some for some that that will be what they what they are looking at. We have seen though over the course of the pandemic that more Canadians have moved out of city centers, kind of chasing not just that affordability, more affordable home ownership opportunities, but a different lifestyle. And so we can also be asking questions about how do we actually get more jobs, more activity to some some other parts of the country that, aren't facing such acute shortages. So I think, again, no panacea, and we really need to see housing, not just social housing, but housing as part of a broader system, that, a big part of our local economies, a big part of, individuals' household balance sheets. And so once you start seeing all those interconnections, how do you make sure that, broader policies aren't having kind of unintended consequences that, make the housing situation worse? In fact, we should be looking at how do these other policy levers, all kind of point in the same direction that, can improve affordability. And, I think, what you describe is, in some contexts is an example of that.
Okay, thank you. And are there any other questions that people have? This has been a wonderful conversation. I love it. And let me pull this down here. And there was something that popped up in the chat. Paul Krugman, professor of economics at Princeton University, has said a number of times that if our institutions, financial, government, etc., invested more in the most vulnerable members of society, like a guaranteed minimum income for one, we would be very beneficial to society and the economy. How can we get our banking system involved in investing in society's vulnerable members?
Well, I can, again, speak from my perch and my mandate in the economics shop. And, part of that title, inclusion, is looking at how to make the economy more generally work for all. And so are we leaving parts of society behind? And so I had looked earlier this year at the issue of Canadians with disabilities, and the number is very high, quite frankly, the number of Canadians that would identify with a disability, and importantly, the number of Canadians with a disability that want a job but can't get a job is almost 1 million. And so, when I looked at that, I looked at, what a loss to the Canadian economy that you have 1 million Canadians that want to work and can't find, a workplace that, that is accessible to them. So it's a loss to the economy, and it's a loss to those individuals and their household because of their inability to, generate a market income. And so certainly, that would be an example where, again, using the bank's voice to identify this as a very big issue. And in that context, I pointed to the federal discussions about a disability benefit, but also pointing to, quite frankly, that's not going to be enough for these households. It's not going to be enough to, to address, for example, high cost of living and high, shelter costs, that we still need, private sector. We still do need labor markets to, provide more accessible workplaces. So, this particular population of more vulnerable Canadians does have, better prospects. And so, that's kind of one example, again, from my perch, that we can, shed light on some of the challenges that, that more vulnerable Canadians may be facing.
Well, that's great. Wonderful answer. I'm thinking that some people may think that economics is a dry kind of approach, but you've really given some life and blood to it. So it's great to hear that your point of view on this. And the final question that we have, get into the chat. From the advanced questions. So what can private citizens do about the housing crisis?
Well, that's a really good question. And I think that, one of the great fortunes, and I think, too often when we're, here in Canada, we can see all the challenges and all the, the difficulties that we face in Canada. But I would say that, we are a democracy, and, we can't take that for granted, that we do have a voice. And, that's certainly on my path. I've certainly looked at countries that are in, very, very challenging situations. And so I think that, is one of very, and making a nonpartisan statement that, we do have generally well-governed institutions in the country, regardless of, political stripes across the country. And yes, we can point to faults, but, I think that is really something that, that citizens can, certainly kind of voice their concerns and their priorities. And, really that, ultimately is what gives leaders and politicians legitimacy to move forward with policies.
There's just so much to think about in this. It's amazing. And I don't know if there are any more questions. Okay, seeing none, I'm just going to say thank you very much. This is, and as I said, people may consider economics a very dry sort of number-based thing, but like I said, you've brought the real blood and guts to the issue. So and thank you very much for your presentation tonight, Rebekah. Just want to say thank you to everybody who's attended tonight. Just a note that we will be, as I said, putting this into our YouTube channel, and we'll have a transcript that goes along with it. And hopefully we'll be able to share your slide deck on this and get it out to people who were not able to attend tonight. And thank you very much once again, Rebekah. Happy to hear that you're in Toronto.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
It's wonderful. It's our pleasure.
Yeah,
And we'll be staying in touch, and we'll keep you up to date on other webinars that we have coming up in the future. And I think Waleed, you're on for our last comment. Oh, froze. Okay. So thanks a lot. And so we'll close the meeting right now and look forward to seeing you all again. We'll keep everybody informed as to our next meetings. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.